Well, how did we get stuck with proportionality? In the 1980s, proportionality was promoted by the oil and gas corporations as a way to gain guaranteed access to the U.S. market during an oil and gas slump in Canada. And by the way, this is the only export that we have that is guaranteed access to the U.S. market. We know that through NAFTA, softwood lumber and everything else, there's no guaranteed market in the U.S. It is only our oil and gas because, of course, the Americans and their corporations want that. Naturally, of course, the U.S. subsidiaries attempted to secure energy use by their parent companies, and domestic corporations saw greater profits in the larger U.S. market. Of course, few people are surprised when corporations act in their self-interest. They always say they're in favor of the bottom line. But why did governments do this? Governments are supposed to protect citizens. This did not happen. Conservative governments in Alberta and Canada and Ottawa worked closely with the oil corporations to overturn the far-sighted policies in the 1970s and early 1980s that promoted energy independence. Now, I'm going to speak favorably about those economic nationalist policies in the 70s and early 80s. Now, of course, some of the national energy program was wrong-headed. There was unilateral federal power was exercised over what was largely Alberta's resource, and rather than federal-provincial cooperation. There was a move away from exploration in Alberta. And there was, of course, the shameless promotion of the Liberal Party. But overall, in fact, the National Energy Program and what happened before that was good and very bold policy. It was the most concerted attempt that we've had in this country to Canadianize the economy, and much of it to do it through public ownership, and to take on the transnational corporations. The majority of Albertans actually supported the Canadianization aspects of the National Energy Program, as did 84% of all Canadians when it first came out. Promoted by the Conservative governments, proportionality was inserted into the Free Trade Agreement with the U.S. to ensure that future Canadian governments could not reverse it. That was kind of to constitutionalize it, to make it really outside of what governments could change. So Canada got stuck with this very bad deal, which makes us more vulnerable to short-term oil shocks than any other international energy agency country. The U.S., of course, is energy insecure too, but for different reasons. The U.S. is 4.6% of the world's population, produces 10% of the world's oil, and consumes 24% of it. If the U.S. government implemented the goal set by Jimmy Carter 31 years ago of living off its own energy resources and not importing, then the average American would still have access to more than double the world's per capita level of oil consumption. You know, if they actually lived on their 10% production, we're 4.6% of the world's population, they would still have way more oil than most people. To illustrate U.S. policy choices, I'm going to look at two people, Walton C. Ferris and Jimmy Carter. You haven't heard of Ferris. He was the career Foreign Service officer in the State Department working on oil matters just before the Second World War. The U.S. Actually has probably inherited the greatest store of oil of any country in the world, more than Saudi Arabia, something like 350 billion barrels, which is about double what the tar sands have. But they've already chewed through more than half of it, way more than half of it. But at that point, the full extent of U.S. reserves was not known, and the planners anticipated that the U.S. would need and their allies would need more oil during the war. So Ferris's solution seems to have guided American policy ever since. As the world's leading oil producer then, the U.S. did have enough domestic oil to give energy for its own needs and its allies' needs. But he argued that if it did so, there would be insufficient domestic oil remaining for future crises. So he recommended the U.S. conserve domestic reserves by not by reducing wasteful use at home, but by using more foreign oil. The problem, he argued, was that other countries also sought additional supplies from the same sources as the U.S., and in those days it was the Middle East, Venezuela, and Mexico. Not all that different from today. So Ferris concluded that U.S. foreign oil policy must be, and I quote, more and more aggressive to ensure U.S. access to foreign oil. So these wartime policies set the U.S. roughly on its present course of preventing a too rapid depletion of American energy resources by depleting other countries' oil and gas, and also developing a symbiotic relationship with U.S. oil corporations, which were acting then in what they saw as the American national interest, security interest. Security of the state, not the people. But, of course, don't raise the issue of the colossal waste of fossil fuels at home as a way to conserve domestic resources. Well, I want to jump forward 35 years to Jimmy Carter, who was in office during the last oil crisis in the 1970s. And he tried to escape from the trap of profligate energy use, but was pulled back into this dominant U.S. pattern of energy wastage at home, leading to an empire around oil abroad. Carter was the only one of the recent presidents who began his term prepared to realistically meet the challenge of falling domestic oil production. Only 3 months into office, this was in, and I gave my talk in Trento on the 31st anniversary of his address. It was on April 18th, 1977, when he addressed the American people, which was what really, when you look back at it, a very far-sighted energy plan, promising U.S. energy independence through the only realistic way, which was substantial cuts in consumption. Carter said that, he started off saying, with the exception of war, the energy crisis was the greatest challenge to America. In language reminiscent of peak oil talk today, Carter warned, and I quote, "The oil and natural gas we rely on for 75% of our energy are running out. Our nation's independence is becoming increasingly constrained." And he put the blame where it belonged. Quote, "Ours is the most wasteful nation on earth. We waste more energy than we import. With about the same standard of living, we use twice as much energy per person as do other countries like Germany, Japan, and Sweden." And he went on to say that if U.S. did not change course, in a few years, demand will overtake production. Sounding like this was 2008 rather than 1977, Carter said the U.S. faced two choices. First, do what we've been doing. Supplies will be uncertain. America will be vulnerable to supply interruptions. We will live in fear of embargoes. We will feel mounting pressure to plunder the environment. We will have a crash program to build more nuclear plants, strip mine, and burn more coal. Now, to the last of this, I think he should have added to this list, we will also have to prepare to get foreign oil, prepare for war to get foreign oil. The second choice, Carter continued, was to act now. We simply must balance our demand for energy with our rapidly shrinking resources. So he was saying that America had to reduce its consumption as its production was falling. The cornerstone of Carter's plan was to reduce the demand through conservation. He tied energy security with environmental protection. Quote, "Our energy problems have the same cause as our environmental problems, wasteful use of resources. Conservation helps us solve both at once." Carter warned that the policies would not be easy or popular and would spark opposition from special interest groups.